You never really think much about a clock, do you? It's just something that sits there on the wall or on the mantel, ticking away quietly. You don't pay attention to it, but it's always there, always ticking. I certainly didn't think much of it when we first brought it home. It was just an old clock, something we picked up at a secondhand store. But if I had known what that clock would do to my family, I would have left it sitting right where it was, gathering dust on that shelf. It all started innocently enough. You know how it goes. Weekend trips to antique shops, browsing through old junk for something that might catch your eye. My wife Emily loved that kind of stuff. Old furniture, knickknacks, things with character, she called them. Me, I was just along for the ride, like usual. We'd been wandering through this musty little store for nearly an hour when Emily spotted it. A tall, old-fashioned clock in the corner, half hidden behind some boxes. It was a beautiful piece, I'll give her that. The wood was dark and worn with age, and the face of the clock had these intricate brass hands that looked handcrafted. It wasn't just some run-of-the-mill mantel clock either. It stood about 6 feet tall, like one of those grandfather clocks, but thinner, more elegant. Emily was immediately drawn to it. She ran her fingers over the wood, inspecting it like she'd found some hidden treasure. "I love it," she said, her eyes lighting up. "It's got so much personality." I wasn't so sure. There was something about it that rubbed me the wrong way. The way the wood felt cold under my hand, or how the glass over the face of the clock was slightly fogged, like it had been sitting there for decades. But Emily was set on it, and when she was set on something, well, that was it. The price was surprisingly low for such a big, old clock, which should have been my first warning sign. But we bought it and brought it home that same afternoon. We didn't think much of it at first. The clock fit perfectly in the living room, right in the corner where Emily thought it could add some charm. It seemed harmless enough, standing there quietly with its long pendulum swinging back and forth, ticking away like any other clock. But that's when the weird stuff started happening. At first, it was just little things. The clock would stop ticking randomly, like it had wound down, even though we'd just set it. I'd wind it up again, and it would start ticking, only to stop hours later. But the thing is, the time on the clock never matched up with the time it had stopped. Sometimes it would be hours off, other times it was days ahead. Emily laughed it off, said it was probably just old and needed a proper tune-up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then there were the noises. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I'd hear it. This soft, almost imperceptible ticking, but it wasn't coming from the clock. It was like it was coming from the walls. Faint, but there, constant. Tick, 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 like the sound had bled out from the clock into the house itself. Emily said it was just my imagination, but I knew what I was hearing. Then one night, something woke me up. It wasn't a noise exactly, but this overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The house was dead quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater kicking on downstairs. But then I heard it. That ticking again, louder this time, more distinct, like it was coming from right outside our bedroom door. I got up, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling or something. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The ticking grew louder as I approached the stairs, and I realized it wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the living room, from the clock. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at the clock in the corner. In the darkness, its face seemed to glow faintly, the brass hands glinting in the moonlight. The pendulum swung slowly, back and forth, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. And then, just as I was about to turn away, the clock chimed. But it wasn't like any chime I'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, almost mournful. The sound vibrated through the air, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt wrong. Like it shouldn't have been chiming at all, not at that hour. I glanced at the time. It was 3:15 in the morning. The clock wasn't supposed to chime then, was it? I walked downstairs, keeping my eyes on the clock the entire time, and something strange happened. The ticking stopped. The moment my foot touched the floor of the living room, the sound just cut out. The pendulum was still swinging, but there was no sound. Nothing. just this heavy, suffocating silence. That was the first night I couldn't sleep. After that, things started getting worse. The ticking became erratic, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, like the clock was struggling to keep time. Objects around the house would move, just slightly, small things like picture frames tilted at odd angles, or books that weren't where I'd left them. But it wasn't until the night our son Jake screamed that I realized something was seriously wrong. It was a Tuesday, around midnight. Emily and I were in bed when we heard it. This blood-curdling scream coming from Jake's room. I've never moved so fast in my life. I raced down the hall, Emily right behind me, and when we threw open his door, we found him huddled in the corner of his bed, shaking. His eyes were wide, wild with terror. "There was someone in my room," he whispered, his voice trembling, "standing by the door." I tried to calm him down, told him it was just a bad dream, but he shook his head violently. "No, I saw him. He was there, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak." Emily held him tight, her face pale with fear, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Someone standing by the door? Watching him? I glanced around his room, half expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone, no footprints, no open windows, just Jake's fear hanging thick in the air. That night, Emily and I lay awake in bed, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside. But underneath it, I could hear it again, that ticking. Things escalated quickly after that. The clock seemed to have a life of its own. The ticking grew louder, more erratic, filling the house at all hours of the day and night. And then the dream started. Emily was the first to mention it. She woke up one morning, pale and shaken, and told me she'd dreamt of the clock. In her dream, it wasn't in the living room anymore. It was in our bedroom, standing at the foot of our bed. The hands of the clock were spinning wildly, faster and faster, until they stopped at midnight. Then in the dream, the glass on the clock's face cracked and something reached out from inside. Something dark. Something with fingers. I laughed it off at first, trying to comfort her. But then I started having the same dream. Every night, the clock would appear, closer and closer to our bed, the hands spinning faster and faster, the chimes growing louder and more distorted. It was driving me mad. I started avoiding the living room altogether, not wanting to be anywhere near that cursed thing. Emily felt it too. She stopped dusting it, stopped decorating around it, like we were both subconsciously trying to pretend it wasn't there. Then one night, I woke up again to that same sense of dread. The house was pitch black, but the ticking, it was everywhere. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the entire house was ticking in time with the clock. I bolted upright, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The clock. It was in our bedroom. It stood there at the foot of our bed, just like in the dream. The hands were spinning wildly, faster and faster, and the air in the room felt thick, heavy, like I was suffocating. Emily woke up beside me, gasping for breath, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get rid of it," she whispered. "Now." We didn't wait until morning. We dragged the clock out of the house, down the steps, and into the backyard. I grabbed an axe from the garage, and without a second thought, I started swinging. The wood splintered under the force of the blows, but with each swing, the ticking grew louder, more frantic, like the clock was screaming. The glass on the face shattered, and the hands fell limp. But still, the ticking continued. It wasn't until I smashed the pendulum that the sound finally stopped. I wish I could tell you that it ended there, that after smashing the clock, we were finally free. But that would have been too simple, wouldn't it? Too neat. Life doesn't work that way, especially not when you're dealing with something unnatural. When I say the ticking was coming from us, I don't mean that figuratively. I mean it quite literally. After we found the clock back in the house, perfectly reassembled as if I hadn't just torn it apart the night before, things took a turn for the worse. Much worse. It started with Emily. I noticed it the next day while we were sitting at the kitchen table, both of us trying to ignore the fact that the clock was back in its usual spot in the living room, ticking away as though nothing had happened. Emily was stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her spoon clinking against the side of the mug. But underneath the sound of the spoon, I heard something else, faint but distinct. Tick, tick, tick. At first I thought it was just my nerves, that the events of the last few days had gotten to me. but the more I listened, the more certain I became. The ticking wasn't coming from the clock anymore. It was coming from her. "Emily?" I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes tired and hollow. "What?" I couldn't find the words. I leaned in closer, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But there it was again, that soft, rhythmic ticking, like a watch buried under her skin. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. You don't hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. She frowned, setting her spoon down. "Hear what?" I swallowed hard. I didn't want to say it, didn't want to make it real by speaking it aloud. "The ticking, it's coming from you." Her face paled. "What are you talking about?" I reached across the table, grabbing her wrist. I pressed my fingers to her skin, just above her pulse, and that's when I felt it. The ticking, right there under her skin, in perfect time with her heartbeat. Emily yanked her hand back, her eyes wide with panic. "You're scaring me." I wanted to tell her it was nothing, that I was just tired, maybe even hallucinating. But the look in her eyes told me she knew something was wrong too. She didn't hear it, but she could see the fear in me. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the ticking grew louder, first in Emily, then in me. At night, as we lay in bed, I could hear it inside my own chest, a steady, mechanical rhythm. Tick, 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 like gears turning inside me. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was always there, echoing in my mind. The kids, too, Jake and Sarah, they didn't say anything, but I noticed how quiet they had become, how their playful laughter had disappeared, replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations behind closed doors. The worst part? The clock still stood there, unmoving, its hands frozen at midnight. It didn't need to tick anymore. It had passed the curse onto us. We were trapped, bound to the clock, no matter where we went in the house. We tried leaving, of course, packed up the kids one morning, threw whatever we could fit into the car, and drove away without looking back. But the moment we crossed the city limits, the ticking stopped. Not in a good way. Oh no, it stopped because something worse replaced it. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that makes your skin crawl because it feels like the world has stopped breathing. The kids started crying in the back seat, their faces twisted in fear, and Emily just sat there, staring straight ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. "What's happening?" I whispered, even though I already knew. It was the clock. It wouldn't let us go. We turned back. When we walked through the front door, the ticking resumed immediately, loud and clear, like it was welcoming us home. And the clock, God, the clock was chiming again. That same deep, resonant tone that rattled through my bones. Midnight. Always midnight. The house was alive with the sound of it. Every wall, every floorboard, every window pane seemed to pulse with the ticking. It was inescapable. We stopped talking about it, stopped pretending that we could fix it. What could we do? Destroying the clock hadn't worked. Leaving hadn't worked. We were stuck, prisoners in our own home, slowly losing our minds. I started keeping track of the time, real time, just to keep myself sane. The clock on the wall never moved from midnight, but I knew it wasn't really midnight. It couldn't be. The sun still rose, still set. The days went on. But inside that house, it felt like time had frozen. And then the dreams came back, for all of us. Jake woke up screaming every night, and I started seeing something in my sleep too, something dark and faceless. It wasn't the clock anymore. It was something inside the clock, something watching us through the glass, waiting. I knew deep down that it wasn't done with us yet. Then one night, everything came to a head. I woke up around 3 a.m., the ticking louder than I'd ever heard it before. My heart was racing, my skin drenched in sweat. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and that's when I saw it. The clock, it was moving. Not just the hands, the whole clock was moving across the living room floor, inching closer to the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. It was like the thing had come to life, like it was dragging itself toward us. I scrambled out of bed, barely able to breathe, and ran to the kids' rooms. Emily was already there, wide-eyed and terrified, clutching Sarah in her arms. "It's happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. The house was vibrating now, the walls shaking with the force of the ticking. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 clocks all ticking in unison. I could feel it inside me, in my bones, in my blood. But when we reached the top of the stairs, the clock was there, waiting for us. It stood at the bottom, its face glowing faintly in the dark, the hands frozen at midnight. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, like the space itself was bending under its presence. And then it spoke, not in words but in the chimes, deep, resonant, tolling chimes that echoed through the house, each one filling me with a cold dread I couldn't describe. It wasn't just a clock anymore, it was something alive, something ancient, and it had claimed us. We were bound to it now, and there was no escaping. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place, the sound of the chimes rattling in our heads. But when it stopped, everything went still. The ticking ceased, the air grew silent, and for a brief moment I thought it was over. But that was when I noticed it, the hands of the clock. They had moved, just slightly. The hour hand had crept forward, not to 1 a.m. but to 12:01. A new day had begun, and with it I realized, so had a new cycle. The clock wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let us go. Every day it would reset, and every day it would draw us further into its grip, its ticking becoming our own heartbeat, its time becoming ours. I don't know how long we've been here now. Days, weeks, maybe months. The sun still rises, but we're not a part of that world anymore. We're trapped in the clock's time, stuck at midnight, counting down the minutes until it takes us completely. And the worst part, the ticking hasn't stopped. It never will. You know, when people talk about camping, they usually talk about campfires, starry nights, roasting marshmallows. Peaceful, right? I used to think that too. I mean, Lucy and I, my girlfriend, we'd been on a bunch of camping trips before, and they were always great. But that one night, the night the storm came, I don't think I'll ever forget it. We had no clue what was coming. It was supposed to be just a regular weekend out in the woods, get away from everything, unplug, you know? We found this spot by a small creek, surrounded by tall pines, totally secluded. It was one of those hidden gems. No one else around for miles. The air was crisp, and you could smell the damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel grounded, at peace. Lucy loved it. She's always been the nature type, and I figured, yeah, a quiet weekend under the stars would be perfect. But then, that afternoon, the clouds started rolling in. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. We'd seen the forecast, just a chance of rain. Nothing we couldn't handle. We even joked about it, saying it would be cozy, listening to the rain while bundled up in our tent. I mean, who doesn't love that sound, right? Little did we know, by the time nightfall came, the rain wasn't just a drizzle anymore. It was a downpour. The sky had turned a deep, bruised shade of gray, and the wind picked up fast. It was almost like the world had been flipped upside down. The trees started swaying, their branches creaking under the force of the wind, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. Lucy and I huddled inside the tent, hoping the storm would pass quickly. We zipped ourselves in tight, laid back on the sleeping bags, and just waited. I could hear the rain hammering down on the nylon above us, turning into a constant, drumming noise that drowned out everything else. I tried to distract her, saying stuff like, "This'll make for a good story later." But deep down, I was starting to get nervous. It wasn't long before we noticed the water. It started slow, just a few droplets trickling through the seams. But then those droplets turned into a steady stream. The ground beneath us felt like it was dissolving. I reached down to touch the floor of the tent, and my hand came back wet. That's when the realization hit me. The creek nearby. We hadn't really thought about it, but with this kind of rain, it wasn't just a peaceful stream anymore. It was rising. "Lucy, we need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale in the dim light of the lantern. She knew it too. The rain wasn't going to stop, and that creek was turning into a flood. We scrambled to get our stuff together, but the tent was already starting to buckle under the weight of the water pooling around us. The ground was turning to mud, sucking at our boots as we struggled to stand. My heart was racing, and every instinct was screaming at me to run, to get to higher ground. But the storm, it was like a wall of chaos outside. The wind howled through the trees, and every time I looked up, it felt like the branches were going to snap off and crush us. We couldn't stay where we were. The water was already ankle deep, and it was rising fast. "We have to go now!" I shouted over the noise of the storm. Lucy nodded, grabbing her backpack, though at this point it felt like a pointless gesture. I mean, what good were dry clothes when everything was already soaked through? We unzipped the tent, and the wind practically ripped the flap out of my hand. The rain hit us like ice, sharp and stinging against our faces. The creek, no, the river now, was roaring, like it was alive, crashing against the rocks and swallowing everything in its path. It was only a few feet away from our campsite, and the current was wild, churning with mud and debris. We couldn't go that way. The only option was to climb up the hill behind us. I grabbed Lucy's hand, and we started to climb. The mud made every step feel like we were sinking, slipping backward as we tried to push forward. The wind howled louder the higher we got, and I could hear trees cracking in the distance, the sound echoing like thunder. We were soaked, freezing, barely able to see through the sheets of rain. Every step felt like a battle, and I kept glancing over at Lucy to make sure she was still with me. Her face was set in determination, but I could see the fear in her eyes. About halfway up, we heard it. This low, guttural growl, not from the storm, but from something else. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but then I saw Lucy stop in her tracks. She had heard it too. "What the hell was that?" she shouted, but I didn't have an answer. I didn't know. All I knew was that we needed to keep moving. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. We kept climbing, but now the panic was setting in. That growling, it wasn't just once. It came again, closer this time. I whipped my head around, trying to peer into the darkness of the trees, but everything was just a blur of shadows and rain. The sound was getting louder, and it felt like it was circling us, like something was following us, watching us. My heart was pounding in my chest, not just from the effort of the climb, but from the overwhelming sense that something was out there. "Come on," I urged, pulling Lucy along. She stumbled, slipping in the mud, but I caught her arm before she fell. We were almost at the top of the hill now, but that noise, God, that noise, was right behind us. I could hear twigs snapping, the rustling of leaves, something moving through the woods, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. Then, just as we reached the top, Lucy screamed. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the storm, standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even human, not really. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline blurred by the rain, but I could see the way it moved, slow, deliberate, like it was stalking us. For a split second, our eyes locked. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its gaze, cold and unblinking. My whole body went numb with terror. I didn't know what it was, and in that moment, I didn't want to know. My only thought was to get the hell away. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Lucy and pulling her with me. We bolted, slipping and sliding down the other side of the hill, the storm raging all around us. I could feel my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I had to get us out of there. The ground was uneven, full of rocks and roots, and I stumbled more than once, but somehow we kept going. The wind was deafening, and the rain was coming down so hard it felt like it was trying to drown us. But behind all of that, I could still hear it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following us down the hill. We ran until we reached the bottom, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. There was a small clearing ahead, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. The trees were closing in on either side of us, and that thing, whatever it was still out there, still hunting us. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, we burst into the clearing. And that's when I saw it. A cabin. An old, weathered cabin, half hidden by the trees, like it had been abandoned for years. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We ran for it, practically collapsing against the door. I fumbled for the handle, my hands shaking, and finally managed to push it open. We stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The sound of the storm outside was muffled now, but the wind still howled, and the rain still pounded against the roof. For a moment, all we could do was stand there, catching our breath, trying to process what had just happened. The cabin was small, dark, with only the faintest light coming from a crack in the roof. It smelled of damp wood and decay, and there were old tools hanging on the walls, rusted, forgotten. But we were safe. At least, we thought we were. Lucy was shaking, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I pulled her close, holding her tight, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. and then we heard it again. That growling. But this time it wasn't outside. It was coming from inside the cabin. Before I could even react, the door burst open. The door exploded inward, the force slamming it against the wall so hard I thought it might come off its hinges. A gust of icy wind swept in, bringing with it the stinging rain and the thick smell of earth and decay. Lucy screamed, and I instinctively pulled her behind me, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But nothing came through the door. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness outside, expecting to see it, the figure that had been stalking us. The wind howled, and the rain fell in sheets, but beyond that, there was nothing. Just the storm, relentless and unyielding. I took a shaky step forward, my legs trembling. "Shut the door," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. She was still shaking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale. I hesitated, peering into the darkness one last time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That thing, it had been right behind us. I'd heard it, I'd felt it, but now there was no sign of it, no movement, no sound, except there. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a shadow, tall, still watching us. The same figure. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was there, staring. My stomach lurched with fear, and I slammed the door shut, twisting the rusted bolt into place. The room plunged into near darkness, lit only by faint slivers of moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the roof. The air inside the cabin was damp and cold, and the walls seemed to close in on us, their surfaces warped and splintered with age. The space felt suffocating, like it hadn't been touched by human hands in years. Lucy collapsed onto an old wooden chair, her hands trembling as she wiped the rain from her face. I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, the panic still clawing at her. I knelt beside her, trying to steady my own breath, my mind still spinning from what we'd seen. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," I said, though my voice felt weak, hollow. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't something natural. No animal moved like that. No person either. We sat there in silence, the only sounds coming from the storm battering the cabin and our own ragged breathing. For a moment, I let myself hope that maybe we'd outrun it. Maybe the cabin would hold, and whatever that thing was, it would go back into the woods, leave us alone. But that hope was shattered when I heard it again, the growl, low, guttural, and inside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Lucy's eyes widened and she clutched my arm. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, barely able to speak. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was closer. I stood slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and scanned the room. The cabin wasn't big, just a single room with a few pieces of rotting furniture and a small hearth in the corner. There were no windows, just the door and a few cracks in the walls that let the cold wind slip through. But the sound, it was here, with us. "Stay here," I whispered to Lucy, though my voice shook with fear. She nodded, her eyes wide, her body stiff with terror. I moved slowly across the room, my feet barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. The growl came again, louder this time, vibrating through the walls. My eyes darted to the corner of the room where a pile of old blankets lay in a heap. The sound was coming from there. I reached for one of the old tools hanging on the wall, a rusted metal hook, heavy and solid in my hand. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I edged closer to the blankets. And then I saw it. A hand. Pale, grayish skin, with fingers that were long and bony, protruding from under the blankets. My stomach churned with revulsion, and I stepped back instinctively. But the hand didn't move. It just lay there, lifeless. "Lucy," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. "There's someone here." She gasped, standing up from the chair, her eyes locked on the motionless hand. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard. We need to know if they're still alive." My words felt ridiculous, but part of me wanted to believe that maybe it was just a person, someone lost in the storm like us, and not something else. I took a deep breath, gripping the rusted hook tightly in my hand, and reached for the blankets. With one swift motion, I yanked them back, revealing the body beneath. What lay there was no person. It was human-like, sure, its frame thin, gaunt, with skin stretched tight over sharp bones. But its face, it was wrong. The eyes were too large, hollow, and black as coal. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and the lips were cracked and dry. Its skin had a strange mottled texture, as though it had been decaying for years but was somehow still alive. I stumbled backward, the hook slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing didn't move, didn't breathe, but its eyes, they were staring right at me. "Lucy," I choked, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But before I could move, the creature's hand twitched. Then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, like something was waking up inside it. I grabbed Lucy's arm, pulling her toward the door, but just as we reached it, the thing let out a screech, a sound so high-pitched and guttural it pierced through the storm outside. The cabin shook with the force of the scream, the walls vibrating as if they were about to cave in. The creature was on its feet now, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. We bolted. I threw the door open, and we ran into the storm, the rain soaking us instantly. Behind us, I could hear the creature stumbling, its feet dragging across the floor of the cabin, the screeching growing louder, echoing in my head. We ran toward the trees, slipping in the mud, the storm raging around us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, Lucy's hand in mine, the terror pushing us forward. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts. You know, those creepy stories people tell around campfires or the kind of stuff they show in horror movies. I always thought it was just fiction. But there's one memory I can't shake. No matter how much I've tried to explain it away, it lingers, like a shadow I can't quite escape. It happened when I was a kid, and it's stuck with me ever since, haunting me in a way I never thought possible. I was about 8 or 9 years old when I first started spending weekends at my aunt's house. She lived in this old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. You know the kind. Big, drafty, with windows that seemed too tall and too narrow, and a front porch that felt like it belonged in another century. It was always dimly lit, even during the day, because the house was surrounded by these enormous gnarled trees that blocked most of the sunlight. My aunt used to say it gave the house character, but to me, it always felt off. Her house had that specific smell too, like old wood, dust, and something else, something musty that I couldn't quite put my finger on. My room, when I stayed there, was this small guest room at the end of a long hallway. The walls were covered in this outdated wallpaper that was peeling in the corners, and the ceiling light cast a dull yellow glow that barely reached the edges of the room. The bed was old, with a squeaky metal frame, and there was a single window that overlooked the backyard, where the trees seemed to huddle too close to the house. It didn't take long for me to notice that something felt wrong in that room. Every time I stepped into it, a chill would run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to ignore it. I was a kid. I had an active imagination, right? I'd tell myself it was just the house being old, or that maybe I was just spooked by being away from home. But the feeling never went away. If anything, it got worse. I'd be lying in bed at night, trying to fall asleep, and I'd get this overwhelming sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. Not just watching, though. It felt hostile, like whatever it was didn't want me there. I'd keep my eyes tightly shut, pulling the covers over my head, hoping it would just go away. But the feeling was suffocating, like the air in the room was thick with tension. I could never bring myself to look around the room, no matter how strong the urge was. I was too scared of what I might see. The worst part was the corner of the room, the one furthest from the bed. It was always dark there, even though the rest of the room was dimly lit. I know it sounds strange, but that corner seemed darker than it should have been, like the shadows there were thicker, just more solid somehow. I was convinced something was hiding there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I never told my aunt about it, though. I didn't want her to think I was just some scared little kid making up ghost stories. And besides, how do you even explain something like that? "Hey, Aunt Linda, I think there's something evil living in the corner of the guest room." It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but every time I stayed there, the feeling got worse. I started dreading those weekends. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that unseen presence in the corner, watching me. I could hear the house creak and groan, the wind howling through the trees outside, but none of those sounds scared me as much as the silence that came from that corner. It was like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. One night, though, everything changed. It was late, way past the time I should have been asleep. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional sound of branches scraping against the window. I was lying in bed, trying to focus on anything other than that corner of the room, when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like words, but I couldn't understand them. My heart started pounding, and I pulled the covers tighter around me, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was just hearing things because I was scared. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the corner. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, my whole body tensing up. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. But then the whisper stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, the cold sweat trickling down my forehead. And then the bed moved. I felt it. A subtle shift, like someone had sat down at the edge of the mattress. The weight of it made the metal frame creak, and my breath caught in my throat. I lay there, frozen, too terrified to move. Whatever was in the corner wasn't in the corner anymore. It was on the bed. I don't know how long I stayed like that, barely breathing, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would explode out of my chest. I could feel the mattress dip under the weight of something. I kept my eyes tightly shut, praying it would go away, that I'd wake up and realize it had all been a nightmare. But then, I felt it. The lightest touch, like fingers grazing the back of my neck. That was when I lost it. I bolted upright, throwing the covers off and scrambling out of bed. I didn't care what time it was or if I woke my aunt. I just had to get out of that room. I ran down the hallway, my feet pounding against the old wooden floors, not stopping until I reached the living room. My aunt found me there a few minutes later, curled up on the couch, shaking. I didn't tell her what had happened, not then. I couldn't. How could I explain it? How could I put into words the terror I had felt? She assumed I'd had a bad dream and let me sleep on the couch for the rest of the night. But it wasn't a dream. I knew that for sure. After that night, I refused to stay in that room again. I made up excuses, saying I preferred the couch or that I wasn't feeling well, and my aunt didn't push me on it. But even after I stopped staying there, the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, that hostile presence lingering just out of sight. It wasn't until years later, when I was in my 20s, that I finally brought it up to my aunt. We were having dinner one night, and out of the blue, I asked her if she had ever felt anything strange in the guest room. She looked at me, surprised, and asked why I wanted to know. So I told her everything, the feeling of being watched, the whispering, the weight on the bed. I half expected her to laugh it off or tell me I was being silly, but instead she went pale. "I've never told anyone this," she said quietly, "but your uncle used to hate that room. He wouldn't sleep in there, not even when we first moved in. He always said it felt wrong, like something was there watching him. After he passed away, I just started using it as a guest room. I figured it was just his imagination." I stared at her, my stomach turning. My uncle had died when I was little, and I hadn't known him well. But hearing her say that, hearing her confirm what I had felt, it made everything so much worse. It wasn't just in my head. There really was something in that room. As much as I've tried to convince myself that it was all in the past, there are nights when I feel like the past isn't done with me. The feeling, the cold, oppressive sensation of being watched, has never truly left. Sometimes it's just a flicker, barely noticeable, but other times, it's stronger. Almost like a memory surfacing, but more real than that. Like whatever was in that room still knows where I am. I remember the first time I felt it again, years after I'd stopped going to my aunt's house. I was living in a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy but cozy enough for me. It had been a long time since I'd even thought about that night. I had pushed the memory down so far that it only surfaced occasionally, usually when someone would bring up ghost stories or weird experiences. But one night, when I was in bed, just on the edge of falling asleep, I felt it again, that same coldness. It started in the pit of my stomach, spreading out until my entire body was tense, my skin prickling with unease. And then, that familiar, awful sensation washed over me, the unmistakable feeling of eyes on me, staring from the darkness. It was like I had been transported back to my aunt's guest room in an instant. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something. The corner of my bedroom, the one just beyond the foot of my bed, felt wrong, just like it had all those years ago. It was darker than it should have been, the shadows hanging there like a thick fog. I sat up, my heart pounding, and I swear I could feel it. That presence. Watching. Waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it grow stronger, like it was creeping closer, inch by inch. I kept the lights on, staring at the corner, too scared to look away, too scared to confront whatever it was that had followed me from my childhood. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of an old memory. But it didn't feel like just a memory. The next day, I tried to put it behind me. I went to work, distracted myself with daily tasks, tried to act like everything was normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever had haunted me back then wasn't done with me, and it seemed to know that I had tried to forget. It wasn't every night, though. Sometimes weeks would go by without a single incident, and I'd start to think that maybe it was over, that maybe it had all been in my head. But then, out of nowhere, it would return, creeping back into my life like a shadow stretching long across the floor. And each time, it was stronger. One night, about a year after that first experience in my apartment, I woke up to the sound of whispering. My heart sank. It was the same as before, soft, unintelligible words just on the edge of hearing, coming from the corner of my room. That same corner. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tense as I strained to hear what it was saying. But this time, something was different. This time, the words were clearer. They were sharp, angry, and even though I couldn't make out the exact words, I could feel the hatred in them. It was like it wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and that's when I felt it. The bed shifted. Just like all those years ago in my aunt's house, I felt the mattress dip, like someone or something had sat down at the edge of the bed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if the room was pressing down on me, keeping me paralyzed as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but deep down, I already knew. It hadn't left me. Whatever it was, it had followed me. I don't remember how I got through that night. I think I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion or fear because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and everything felt normal again. The heavy, oppressive feeling was gone, and the room felt like just a room. But I knew better. I knew it was still there, waiting for the right moment to return. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. It didn't always help, but it gave me a small sense of control, like maybe if I could see the room clearly, it wouldn't have the power to terrify me. I also stopped spending nights alone as much as possible. I invited friends over, went out late, did anything I could to avoid being alone in that apartment after dark. But deep down, I knew I was just delaying the inevitable. One evening, I decided to confront it. I was tired of living in fear, tired of waiting for it to show up on its own terms. I sat down in my bedroom, right in front of the corner where it always seemed to linger. I felt foolish at first, sitting there alone, staring into an empty corner, but I knew it wasn't empty. I could feel it. For a long time, I just sat there, staring into the shadows, waiting. Nothing happened. The air felt still, heavy, but there was no movement, no whispering, no presence. But then, after what felt like hours, I saw it. Just a flicker at first, barely noticeable, a movement in the dark like a ripple. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to run this time. And then I heard it. The whispering. Faint, angry, just like before. But this time, I was ready. I spoke out loud, my voice shaking but determined. "I know you're here," I said. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not afraid of you anymore." The room went silent. The whispering stopped. And for a moment, I thought maybe it had worked, that maybe I had finally confronted it. But then, in the quiet, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, so close that I could feel the chill crawl down my spine. I whipped around, expecting to see something standing behind me, but there was nothing, just empty air. But I knew it had been there. I could feel it. Since that night, the incidents have been less frequent. It still comes back sometimes, still makes its presence known, but it's different now. We've reached some sort of unspoken understanding. I don't challenge it, and it doesn't press as hard as it used to. It's almost like it's satisfied with the fear it's already caused, like it no longer needs to push me to the edge. But I know it's not gone. Not really. And I still wonder, sometimes late at night, if it's waiting for the right moment to strike again. It was one of those nights you just wish would end. I'd been on the road for hours, an endless stretch of highway cutting through the middle of nowhere. The kind of road where you can drive for miles and not see another soul. The truck hummed beneath me, the engine steady, but my eyes were heavy, and my hands ached from gripping the wheel. I needed gas, a break, maybe a coffee. Something to shake off that creeping fatigue that seeps into your bones after too long on the road. Then I spotted it, a gas station, just off the next exit. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the otherwise pitch-black surroundings. It looked old, like something out of a forgotten era, back when gas was 50 cents a gallon and people didn't lock their doors. But I didn't care about the aesthetics. I needed fuel, and this was the first station I'd seen in hours. As I pulled in, the headlights of my rig swept across the pumps, rusty, old, barely standing. The place was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no other trucks, nothing. Just that faint hum of electricity from the neon sign and the distant whistle of the wind sweeping across the open plains. I killed the engine, the silence immediately making the air feel thicker, heavier somehow. There was a single light above the door to the small convenience store attached to the station, casting a dim, almost sickly yellow glow. I could see someone inside, standing at the counter, but their back was to me. Just the attendant, I figured. I grabbed my wallet and stepped out of the truck, the door creaking louder than I expected. The wind picked up, a sharp, cold gust that sent shivers down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter and made my way to the pump. The thing looked ancient, like it hadn't been used in years. I almost doubted it even worked, but I gave it a shot anyway. Sure enough, after some effort, the gas started flowing. As I stood there waiting for the tank to fill, I glanced around. The station was surrounded by nothing but flat land, stretching out in every direction, swallowed by the night. There was something unsettling about the vast emptiness. No trees, no hills, just nothing. That's when I heard it, a strange clicking sound coming from inside the store. At first I thought maybe it was just the flickering neon sign or something mechanical. But then it happened again, and this time it was louder, rhythmic, like clockwork. Click, click, click. It reminded me of gears turning, metal grinding against metal, but there was something off about it. Something unnatural. I shook it off, telling myself it was just some old machinery in the building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. You ever get that sense, like eyes are on you even though you're alone? That was exactly what it felt like. The tank was almost full, and I was more than ready to leave. I just needed to pay and get back on the road. I walked toward the door, the bell above it jingling as I stepped inside. The tank was almost full, and I was more than ready to leave. I just needed to pay and get back on the road. I walked toward the door, the bell above it jingling as I stepped inside. The place was just as run down on the inside as it was on the outside. Dust covered the shelves, and the smell of stale air hit me the moment I walked in. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, dim and flickering, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The attendant, he was standing behind the counter, facing away from me, his back hunched slightly. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel a knot tightening in my gut. No response. "Hey, I just need to pay for the gas," I said, a little louder this time. The guy didn't move. That's when I noticed something strange. His arms, they were too stiff, almost rigid, like they weren't real. And his head, it was tilted at an unnatural angle, just a little too far to the side. My throat tightened and I took a step closer. Buddy? You all right?" Then slowly, too slowly, he turned around. The face staring back at me wasn't right. It was human, but not. His skin was smooth, too smooth, like plastic. His eyes were glassy, devoid of life, and his mouth, it didn't move. Not naturally, anyway. It clicked open, just slightly, like a puppet's mouth on a broken hinge. The sound of that clicking echoed in the room. For a moment, I was frozen, caught between disbelief and the urge to bolt out of there. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but I stood rooted to the spot. Then, out of nowhere, his body jerked, violently, like something inside him had malfunctioned. His head snapped to the side again, and his arms swung upward, pointing at the register, his fingers locking into place with another unsettling click. I stumbled back, knocking into one of the shelves. The contents clattered to the floor, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my wallet, tossing a couple of crumpled bills on the counter, not bothering to check if it was enough. I turned and bolted for the door. The moment I stepped outside, I heard it again, that clicking sound. But this time it wasn't coming from inside the store. It was behind me. I whipped around, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his head tilted to that same unnatural angle, his arms hanging limply at his sides. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, in the shadows of the store, I could see more figures. Motionless at first, but slowly they began to move, emerging from the darkness. They were all the same, pale, lifeless faces, stiff, jerky movements, clicking, always that damned clicking. I backed away, my mind racing. What the hell were they? Robots? Mannequins? Some kind of sick joke? But the fear coursing through my veins was too real to be a prank. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran back to the truck, my boots slamming against the pavement, the cold air biting at my skin. I could hear them behind me, the clicking growing louder, closer, like they were right on my heels. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, finally managing to get the door open. I jumped inside, slammed it shut, and locked it. My heart was in my throat as I jammed the key into the ignition, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped them. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I hit the gas and peeled out of there, the tires screeching as I sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror I saw them, standing in a line at the edge of the gas station lot, just watching as I drove away. Their eyes, cold, empty, seemed to follow me, even as they grew smaller in the distance. For a while I just drove. The road blurred under the headlights, and my mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. I glanced at the dashboard and realized my tank was still nearly full. I hadn't even needed to stop at the gas station. And then, out of nowhere, the radio, silent the entire drive, flickered to life. But it wasn't music that played. It was a voice, a low, monotone voice. "We'll see you again soon." I slammed my fist against the radio, cutting the voice off. The highway stretched out ahead, dark and endless, but I kept driving, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun whatever the hell had just happened. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart still pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the terror I had just escaped. But had I really escaped? The road stretched out endlessly before me, a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through the night, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those pale faces, those lifeless eyes still following me. The voice on the radio haunted me. It had been so clear, so deliberate. "We'll see you again, soon." But who were they, and why me? My headlights cut through the night, illuminating nothing but empty road ahead. The wind howled outside, rattling the truck's windows, and the occasional gust sent dead leaves skittering across the asphalt. I tried to push the memory of that gas station out of my mind, tried to convince myself it was some kind of hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and too many hours on the road. But the fear still clung to me, a cold, creeping sensation that I couldn't shake. After a while, the road began to change. The endless flat plains gave way to rolling hills, the kind that seemed to swallow the horizon and make you feel like you're the only person left in the world. It should have been comforting, a sign that I was leaving that cursed place behind, but it wasn't. The deeper into the hills I drove, the darker it got. The sky seemed to press down on me, the stars swallowed by thick clouds, and the air felt heavier, colder. I needed to stop. Not because I wanted to, God knows I didn't want to stop again tonight, but because I couldn't keep going like this. My body was screaming for rest, and I was starting to see things out of the corners of my eyes. Shadows moving in the trees, shapes flickering just outside the reach of my headlights. I knew I had to pull over before I did something stupid like fall asleep at the wheel. Then I saw it. Another gas station. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It looked almost exactly like the one I'd just left. Same flickering neon sign, same rusted pumps, even the same dim light above the door. But this one was different. The sign, barely legible in the weak glow of the neon, read Midway Stop. I hadn't seen it before on the map, hadn't passed any signs for it on the highway. But there it was, nestled between the hills, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. I pulled in, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to keep driving. The truck rumbled to a stop beside the pump, and for a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the station through the windshield. The windows of the store were dark, and there was no movement inside. No attendant at the counter, no strange clicking sounds, just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. I needed gas, needed a break. That was all. I stepped out of the truck, and the cold night air hit me like a wall, biting into my skin. The wind was louder now, whistling through the trees that lined the edge of the lot, their branches swaying in rhythm. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, and walked toward the pump. As I reached for the nozzle, my hand froze. There, on the ground beside the pump, was a single, white plastic card. It was worn, almost translucent, like it had been there for years. But what stopped me in my tracks was the name printed on it. Midway Stop Gas Station, employee ID number 0726. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized that number. It was the same one I'd seen on the employee's name tag at the last station, the one with the strange face, the clicking movements. My hand trembled as I bent down to pick up the card, turning it over in my fingers. The plastic was cold, and the corners were frayed, but the words were still clear. And then I heard it again, that unmistakable rhythmic click, click, click. I whipped around, expecting to see him, the lifeless attendant, the twisted face, but there was no one, just the wind and the rustle of the trees. But the sound didn't stop. It was growing louder, closer, like something mechanical was approaching. I backed away from the pump, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening, not again. But as the sound grew louder, I could feel the weight of dread settling in my chest. I spun toward the truck, ready to jump in and floor it, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the entrance to the store, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. Tall, still, and staring at me. I didn't wait. I bolted for the truck, yanking open the door and jumping inside. My hands shook as I tried to get the keys into the ignition, but they slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor. I cursed under my breath, scrambling to grab them. All the while that damned clicking sound grew louder and louder, filling the air, seeping into my bones. Finally, I got the engine started. The truck roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I sped out of the station, not daring to look back. The road twisted ahead of me, and I took the turns at breakneck speed, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But the clicking, it wouldn't stop. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside the truck. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced at the passenger seat, and there, sitting upright with its head tilted at that unnatural angle, was the attendant. The same lifeless eyes, the same plastic face, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque smile, and that damned click, click, click. I swerved, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. The truck veered off the road, skidding to a stop in a patch of gravel. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled with the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling out into the cold night. I looked back at the truck, expecting to see him sitting there, waiting for me. But the seat was empty. The only sound now was the wind. No clicking, no voices, just the steady rustle of the trees in the darkness. I stood there, panting, staring at the truck, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay here. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I finally climbed back into the truck. My hands were still trembling, but I managed to start the engine again. The radio was silent, the dashboard lights glowing faintly in the darkness. I drove, not caring where I was going, as long as it was far away from that place. The road stretched on, endless, and I kept driving through the night, with only one thought repeating over and over in my mind. They'll see me again, soon. I'm not really the kind of guy who scares easily. I mean, I've been through my share of weird situations, but this one's different. I still don't know how to explain it, but something happened to me a few months ago, and I can't shake it. I've tried to forget it, but it's like a stain in my memory, always there, always reminding me of that night. It started out pretty normal. I was in this small pub downtown, one of those cozy, dimly lit places where you go when you just want to have a drink and relax. It had a certain charm to it. Old wooden floors that creaked when you walked, low ceilings, and just the faintest smell of stale beer mixed with whatever cleaning solution they used. I'd been there a few times before. Never anything exciting, just a place to unwind after a long week. That night was no different. I sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and mindlessly scrolled through my phone. The place wasn't crowded. A few people scattered at tables, a couple sitting near the back, and the bartender cleaning glasses behind the counter. The kind of night where you could just get lost in your own thoughts. Then she walked in. I didn't notice her at first. She wasn't loud or flashy or anything like that, just there. She sat a few stools down from me, ordered a drink, and just kind of stared at the bar for a while. I glanced over, out of habit more than curiosity, and she caught my eye. There was something about her that immediately felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She wasn't unattractive, but not beautiful either. Just unsettling. It wasn't her appearance exactly. It was more the way she carried herself. Her posture was too stiff, like she was holding herself together with invisible strings. I gave her a polite nod and went back to my drink, but she didn't look away. She kept staring, this blank, almost vacant look in her eyes. You ever get that feeling when someone's watching you, but you try to pretend they're not? That was me. But I could feel her gaze on me, burning a hole through my side. After a minute or two, I heard her say something. I couldn't make it out at first. It was too soft, almost like she was talking to herself. But then she said it again, louder this time. "Mind if I sit here?" I looked up, surprised. She was already standing, her drink in hand, waiting for my response. I wasn't in the mood for company, but I didn't want to be rude either. So I nodded, and she slid onto the stool right next to mine. Now I should have known something was off right then and there. The place was nearly empty. She could have sat anywhere, but she chose the seat right next to me. We made small talk at first, the usual stuff. Where you're from, what you do for work, that sort of thing. But every time I answered, I got this strange feeling like she wasn't really listening. She'd nod or smile, but her eyes, those eyes, wouldn't change. They stayed empty, almost like she was rehearsing her reactions rather than feeling them. And then she started lying. At first, it wasn't obvious. She told me her name was Claire, that she'd moved to the city recently for work. But then, as we talked, things didn't add up. I asked what part of town she lived in, and she said something vague like, "Oh, just around." I asked what she did for a living, and she gave me 3 different answers in the span of 5 minutes. First, she worked in marketing. Then, she said she was a teacher. And later, she mentioned something about being in real estate. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just messing with me or maybe had too much to drink. But the more we talked, the more it became clear that she was lying about everything. Her stories never matched up. One minute she said she was from California. The next she claimed she grew up in New York. It was like she couldn't keep her own story straight. And yet she didn't seem to care that I was catching on. It was almost like she wanted me to notice. My gut started to churn. I could feel this tension building, like I was on the edge of something bad but couldn't see it yet. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get up and leave, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about her, maybe it was the way she was looking at me, or the way her voice seemed too calm for someone who was spinning all these lies. It kept me in my seat, frozen. At one point, she leaned in closer, her face only inches from mine. I could smell her breath, sweet like she'd just chewed on mint gum, but beneath it there was something sour. You don't believe me, do you? She whispered. I didn't answer at first. I just stared at her, unsure of what to say. I can see it in your eyes, she continued, smiling now. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, like she was amused by my discomfort. You think I'm lying, but I'm not. Not about the important stuff. That's when the anxiety kicked in, full force. My hands were sweating and my heart was racing, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to stand up and walk away. It felt like she had some invisible grip on me. Like the more I wanted to leave, the more rooted I became in that stool. Then, she said something that sent a chill down my spine. You're not going anywhere, she whispered, leaning in even closer. I've been waiting for you. At that point, something inside me snapped. I pushed back from the bar, the legs of my stool scraping loudly against the wooden floor. My mouth was dry, and I stammered some excuse about needing to leave, but she didn't move. She just sat there, still smiling, her eyes following me as I grabbed my jacket. I left the pub without looking back, practically running down the street toward my car. My mind was racing. Who the hell was she? And how did she know I wanted to leave? The whole thing was too weird, too off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But it didn't end there. When I got to my car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I glanced back toward the pub, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway, watching me. But the entrance was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, got into my car, and sped off. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, those eyes. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that she was just some creepy woman with a few too many drinks. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I knew something was off about her. Then, the messages started. It was a week after I'd met her. I was sitting at home scrolling through my phone when I got a text from an unknown number. I told you you're not going anywhere. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't reply. How did she get my number? How did she even know where to find me? I deleted the message, hoping that would be the end of it. But the texts kept coming. Every day, at random times, I'd get these cryptic messages from her. Sometimes they were short, just a few words. I see you. Other times they were longer, more disturbing. You can't escape me. I'll always be there. I started looking over my shoulder wherever I went, convinced she was watching me. I'd see people walking by on the street and wonder if she was one of them, hiding in plain sight. I couldn't concentrate at work. I barely slept. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was another message. Look outside. I hesitated. My bedroom window was half open, and the night air had a chill to it. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore it, to close the window and go back to sleep. But curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I crept toward the window and pulled back the curtain. She was standing there, right outside, in the middle of the street, staring up at me. The dim light from the street lamp cast long shadows on her face, but there was no mistaking those eyes. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, waiting. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, but when I looked back outside, she was gone. Vanished. Like she'd never been there at all. The police didn't take me seriously, of course. How could they? I sounded like a lunatic, trying to explain how a woman I barely knew was stalking me. They sent an officer to patrol the neighborhood for a few nights, but nothing came of it. She didn't show up again, at least not in person. The texts kept coming, more frequently now, and they were getting darker. She talked about things I'd never told anyone. Secrets. Things from my past that no one could have known. I thought maybe after that last night when I saw her outside my window, things would calm down. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just paranoid, stressed, overtired. But deep down, I knew better. She wasn't gone. And every time I looked at my phone, every time it buzzed in my pocket, my stomach twisted with dread. I started to hate that sound, the buzzing. Every time it went off, I jumped. The texts kept coming, and every message felt more personal, more intrusive. It was like she was digging deeper into my mind, finding things I didn't even want to think about, let alone share. Things I hadn't told a soul. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty, like the air itself was heavy with tension. It was around 2 a.m. when I got another text. "You think you're safe?" I sat up, my hands shaking. I didn't respond. I hadn't responded to any of her messages. What was the point? I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she was getting to me, but she already knew. I could feel it. The next message came a minute later. "I'm closer than you think." My blood turned cold. I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. Everything was still. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of a car passing by on the street below. Nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that she was watching me. I checked the locks on my front door, double-checked even. Locked, just like I'd left them. I paced around the apartment, trying to calm myself down, trying to convince myself that this was just another mind game. But the fear was creeping in, faster and faster, until it was all I could feel. I was losing it. I knew I was. I walked back to my bedroom and grabbed my phone, ready to turn it off for the night. But as I picked it up, another message came through. "I'm already inside." My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Inside? Inside where? Slowly, I turned and scanned the room. My bedroom was dimly lit by the streetlight outside, just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal, but I knew better by now. She had to be playing with me. This had to be a game. I crept toward the closet, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. With one hand, I gripped the door handle and pulled it open in one swift motion. Empty. The closet was empty. I let out a shaky breath, a small laugh escaping my lips. Of course it was empty. I was letting her get into my head, but then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, like the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat, and there she was, standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of the streetlight, barely visible in the shadows. But I knew it was her. That silhouette, the way she stood, perfectly still, arms at her sides, her face obscured by the darkness. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I couldn't see her eyes, but I knew she was watching me. I could feel it, that same cold, hollow gaze I'd felt in the pub, in the text messages, in every moment since I'd first met her. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, locked in place by this overwhelming sense of dread. "Why are you doing this?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, cracking with fear. She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. And then slowly she took a step forward. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled back, my feet catching on the edge of the bed. She took another step and another, each one measured, deliberate. My back hit the wall, and I realized I had nowhere to go. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking, barely more than a whisper now. She stopped, just a few feet from me, close enough that I could see the outline of her face, but not enough to make out any real details. Her presence was suffocating. The air around her felt colder, heavier, like she was drawing the warmth from the room. For what felt like an eternity, she just stood there watching me. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a breath, she said, "You." I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, my knees going weak. I didn't understand. What did she mean, you? What did she want from me? Before I could say anything, she reached out. Her hand, cold like ice, brushed against my arm, and I flinched. But when I looked down, there was no hand. There was no one there. I blinked, my vision blurred for a moment, and when I looked back up, she was gone. Just like that, vanished into thin air. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't make sense of it. None of it made sense. She had been right there. I had felt her touch me. But now the room was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. I checked the door, the windows. Everything was locked, just as it had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, somewhere, watching me. I barely slept that night, and when I finally did, my dreams were haunted by her face. Those eyes that seemed to look right through me, those whispered words, "You." The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't explain it. I grabbed my phone, half expecting another message from her. But there was nothing. No texts, no missed calls, nothing. For the next few days, I waited for her to show up again, waited for the texts to start pouring in. But it was quiet, too quiet. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt more anxious, like the calm before a storm. And then, just as I was starting to think maybe it was over, maybe she'd finally given up, she came back. Not in a text, not in a reflection, in person. I was sitting at my desk at work, mindlessly typing away when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up, and there she was, standing just outside the glass door of my office building, watching me. I stood up, my heart racing, and made my way toward the door, but by the time I reached it, she was gone, vanished into the crowd of people on the sidewalk like a ghost. But I knew she wasn't gone. Not really. She was still out there, waiting, watching, and she wasn't going to stop. Not until she got what she wanted. You know, I've never been the type to believe in weird, supernatural stuff. Ghosts, haunted houses, curses, all that crap. Nah, I've always been too practical for that. But I swear, what happened to me after that music festival in LA, it changed me. It's been a few months now, and I still can't shake it. It feels like something stuck to me, following me around like a shadow that won't go away. It all started when I flew to LA for a music festival. I was hyped for it. Good music, good food, meeting new people. You know how festivals are, just pure energy. I was there with a few friends, and we had a blast. The weather was perfect, the city was alive, and for those few days, it felt like nothing in the world could go wrong. But things started getting weird when I was on my way back to Texas. The festival had wrapped up, and I had this early morning flight from LAX. You know that feeling when you've had an amazing time, but now you're exhausted and just want to get home? That was me. I was beat. I just wanted to get to the airport, board the plane, and pass out for the whole flight. So I caught the shuttle from the hotel to the airport, the usual stuff. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as soon as I got to the terminal, that's when things shifted. I was waiting near my gate, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed this woman. She was standing by the windows, not far from where I was sitting, but just enough to be out of my line of sight unless I turned my head. At first, I didn't think much of her. She was tall, wearing a long dark coat, kind of odd for LA weather, but whatever. What caught my attention wasn't her clothes, though. It was the way she was staring at me. I mean, full on, locked eyes with me, like she knew me or something. It wasn't the casual glance you get when you make eye contact with a stranger. No, this was intense, like she was trying to figure me out, or maybe follow me with her eyes. I looked away, pretending like I hadn't seen her. I thought, maybe I'm just being paranoid. I get like that when I'm overtired. But every time I glanced back, she was still staring. Same position, same blank expression. It made me uncomfortable, sure, but I told myself it was nothing. I'd probably never see her again, and she'd be just another strange person you pass in an airport. But that's the thing. I did see her again. I boarded my flight and settled into my seat, window side, with no one next to me. I figured I'd be asleep before we even took off. But as I was buckling my seatbelt, I looked up, and there she was, walking down the aisle. My heart skipped a beat. The same woman from the terminal, now on my flight. She wasn't looking at me this time, just walking slowly, scanning the rows like she was looking for her seat. For a second I felt relief, thinking maybe she wasn't following me after all. But then she stopped, right next to my row. She slid into the seat directly behind me. My skin prickled. I could feel her presence, even though I wasn't looking at her. The back of my neck tingled, like she was staring at me again, even though I couldn't see her face. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like I knew she was focused on me. I tried to shake it off. I closed my eyes, took a few deep breaths, told myself to relax. I mean, it's a flight, right? She probably booked this weeks ago, pure coincidence. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. You ever feel like someone's too close to you? Like they've invaded your personal space, even when they technically haven't touched you? That's how it felt. like her energy was pressing up against me, suffocating almost. I forced myself to look out the window, distracting myself with the view of the airport, the runway lights flickering in the dark. But the weirdness didn't stop there. As the plane started taxiing, the sound of the engines roaring, something odd happened. You know how the cabin hums when the plane's moving, that steady drone? Well, in the middle of that hum, I thought I heard something, a whisper. Faint at first, but clear enough that I couldn't mistake it. It wasn't coming from the speakers or the flight attendants. No, it was coming from behind me, and I swear to God it was my name. Matt. Just a soft, almost playful whisper. My blood ran cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My brain was screaming at me to look, to confront whoever was messing with me, but my body refused. It was like I was frozen in my seat, unable to move, unable to breathe. The plane took off, climbing higher and higher, and the whispering stopped. For a few minutes, I actually convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was just the stress, maybe the altitude messing with my head. But then it started again. This time, the voice was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just whispering my name anymore. It was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. They were garbled, like she was speaking in some strange, broken language. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. I tried to focus on my breathing, on staying calm, but it was impossible. That voice, her voice, was inescapable. I wanted to scream, to yell at her to stop, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I just sat there, feeling like a prisoner in my own seat, trapped between the window and that thing sitting behind me. When we finally landed in Dallas, I bolted. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, I grabbed my bag and practically ran off the plane. I didn't look back, didn't even check to see if she was still there. All I could think about was getting out of that airport as fast as possible. But even after I got off the plane, even after I stepped outside into the cool Texas air, I couldn't shake it. That feeling, it was like she was still with me. I told myself it was over, that she was just some crazy person who'd messed with my head. But deep down I knew that wasn't true, because a few days later, I saw her again. I was on the train, commuting to work, when I felt it, that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I glanced up from my phone, and there she was, standing at the other end of the train car, staring right at me. Same dark coat, same blank expression. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random woman, this was something else. Something that had latched onto me, followed me from LA to Texas. It's been months now and she's still there. I see her everywhere, at the grocery store, in the parking lot, on the bus. Always watching, always silent. I've tried telling myself that it's in my head, that I'm just seeing things, but it feels too real, too constant. I don't know what she wants or why she's following me. But the worst part, I don't think she's going away. And every time I see her, she gets closer, closer. I thought maybe if I just ignored her, she'd go away. You know, like when you try not to think about something and hope it just disappears. But it didn't work. The more I ignored her, the more she seemed to appear, and not just when I was out in public. It started small. I'd catch glimpses of her in places she couldn't possibly be. Reflections. I know how that sounds, but I swear, every time I walked past a window or a mirror, I'd see her standing in the background, just out of focus. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me, like those moments when you think you see something out of the corner of your eye, but when you look again, it's gone. But this was different. She wasn't gone. She was there, every time. Her face never changed, still that same blank expression, like she was waiting for something. But it was the eyes that bothered me the most. They weren't normal. It's hard to explain. They were too dark, like two bottomless pits. Every time I saw them, it felt like they were pulling me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I started avoiding mirrors, covering them up, refusing to look out the windows of my apartment at night. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape her. The worst moment came about 2 months after the flight. I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch and watch some mindless TV. For a few hours, everything was fine. It was almost like I could pretend things were normal again, like maybe she'd finally given up and left me alone. But then something happened that I'll never forget. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m., and I was getting ready for bed. My apartment isn't big, just a small one-bedroom place with a narrow hallway that leads from the living room to the bedroom. I turned off the TV, switched off the lights, and started walking down the hallway ready to call it a night. And then I froze. At the end of the hallway, in the darkness of my bedroom, I saw her. She was standing right there, completely still, facing me. I couldn't see her clearly at first. It was dark, and the shadows seemed to blur around her figure, but I knew it was her. My heart started racing, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. She didn't say anything. She never did. She just stood there, watching me. It felt like hours passed, though I know it was probably only seconds. And then slowly she started moving, but not like a person walking. No, she sort of glided, like her feet weren't even touching the ground. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I was paralyzed. She was getting closer and closer, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop. It was freezing, like the warmth had been sucked out of the air. And then, just as she was inches from me, she stopped. I could see her face clearly now, those empty black eyes staring straight into mine. She opened her mouth, just slightly, as if she was about to say something, but all that came out was a faint hiss, like a whisper in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly the lights in my apartment flickered, and in that brief moment of light, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next, the hallway was empty. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could she just disappear like that? I didn't know what to think. I locked myself in my bedroom that night, barely slept a wink. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, had me jumping out of my skin. I kept the lights on, even though I knew it wouldn't stop her if she decided to come back. But that wasn't the last time I saw her. The next few weeks were a blur. I didn't go out much, didn't talk to my friends. I was afraid to tell anyone what was happening. What could I even say? Hey, I think I'm being haunted by a woman from an airplane? Yeah, no one would believe that. Hell, I barely believed it myself. I tried to keep living my life as normally as I could, but it was impossible. Everywhere I went, she was there, always at a distance, always watching. She'd show up in the most unexpected places. I'd be in line at the grocery store and I'd catch her reflection in the glass door of a freezer aisle. Or I'd be driving to work, and I'd see her standing on the side of the road as I passed. I was losing it. I knew it, my mind was unraveling. Then, one night, something changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fight off sleep. That's when I heard it. A knock. Faint, but unmistakable. It came from the front door. I didn't move at first. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. My heart started racing. I sat up, listening. The knocking didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I got out of bed, my legs shaking as I walked toward the door. The hallway felt longer than usual, like I was walking through a tunnel. My breath was coming in short gasps, my mind racing with possibilities. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a second, I thought about just walking away, pretending I didn't hear anything. But something pulled me, like I had no choice. I opened the door, and there she was, standing on the other side as if she'd been waiting for me all along. This time, though, something was different. She was closer than ever before, her face inches from mine. I could see every detail now, the pallor of her skin, the lifelessness in her eyes. She looked dead. And then, "Let me in," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost sweet, but there was something beneath it, something dark. I could feel it in my bones. I wanted to slam the door in her face, but I couldn't move. It was like she had me under a spell, her eyes boring into mine. "Let me in," she said again, more insistent this time. I don't know why, but I reached for the door, about to pull it open wider, when suddenly I snapped out of it. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and backed away, gasping for air. I waited for her to knock again, but there was nothing. Just silence. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, expecting her to break it down or do something, anything. But she didn't, and from that night on, she was gone. I haven't seen her since. No more whispers, no more reflections, no more cold chills. It's like she just disappeared, as quickly as she had come into my life. But I can't help wondering, was it really over? Or was she just waiting for the right moment to come back?